Corruption continues to pose a substantial hurdle for Zimbabwe, as evidenced by international indices like the Corruption Perceptions Index, where the country continues to score below the sub-Saharan African average. The scourge has infiltrated various sectors and spheres of life, including the education sector. After receiving numerous reports of corruption in the education sector through its outreach activities, Transparency International Zimbabwe conducted an exploratory study on corruption in the higher and tertiary education sector in Zimbabwe. The higher and tertiary education sector, or HTE sector, includes a range of institutions, namely universities, colleges, polytechnics, technical and vocational education and training (TVET), and industrial training centers. And it has its distinct policy, regulatory and institutional framework. Transparency International Zimbabwe believes that this topic merits analysis and dialogue among concerned stakeholders because it marginalizes various vulnerable groups and significantly hinders citizens' access to the right to education, as well as several targets in the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. The study aimed to review the policy, regulatory and institutional frameworks for transparency, accountability and integrity in the HTE sector, gauge stakeholders' perceptions on the levels of corruption in the sector, identify the major forms of corruption prevalent in the sector and their causes, gauge levels of awareness within the sector of the country's anti-corruption frameworks, identify the impacts of corruption occurring in the sector, provide tangible sector-specific anti-corruption strategies to address any concerns identified. To gain information on these objectives, the research reviewed existing literature on the subject and captured the opinions of stakeholders who are involved directly or indirectly in higher and tertiary education across the country. These included policymakers, bureaucrats, employees of higher education institutions, learners, representatives of businesses, non-profits, and the media. The literature review identified various forms of corruption relevant to this sector, such as academic fraud through exam leaks, awarding fake degrees, blackmail and extortion, where teaching staff impose charges for supplementary tutoring, bribery in admissions and examinations, plagiarism through the deliberate falsification, misstatement, and alteration of evidence of data. Other forms of corruption include nepotism in the recruitment of staff, unqualified admissions, embezzlement, or the general misappropriation of sector or institutional funds, procurement irregularities, malpractices, such as improper awarding of tenders, favoritism, patronage, and political corruption. For example, favoritism in recruiting staff and grand corruption involving the misuse of manpower development resources. Sextortion, where victims are forced to offer sexual favors for enrollment or grades. This literature review informed the design of the survey questionnaire, which reached 364 respondents from all 10 provinces of Zimbabwe through face-to-face interviews and online platforms. Combined with the documentary analysis, the survey research indicates that 41.8% of respondents expressed good knowledge when asked to rate their levels of knowledge on the prevalence of corruption in Zimbabwe. In describing the problem of corruption in the higher and tertiary education sector, a considerable proportion, 40.9%, described it as a serious problem. Participants likened corruption in the sector as being a small-scale representation of the national situation with corruption, described as widespread in its severity. Several forms of corruption were identified in the online survey, with sextortion 53.3 and academic fraud 48.6 being the most common forms in the sector. The academic level of teaching and learning, identified by a majority of 42.6% in the online survey, was cited as the most vulnerable to corruption risk in the sector when compared to the policy, and regulatory level and institutional management level. In the qualitative findings, procurement malpractice stuck out as the most prominent form of corruption in institutional management, coupled with embezzlement, corrupt allocation of accommodation in student welfare, and nepotism in the recruitment of staff. Meanwhile, the academic level was afflicted with sextortion in the interaction between teaching staff and learners, with learners alleged to be initiating this type of corruption sometimes. Several causal factors or drivers of corruption were identified throughout the higher and tertiary education chain, where opportunities presented themselves for individuals to abuse their position of influence. At the top of the online survey was greed or financial gain, 17.8%, followed by poor remuneration, 17.5%. Academic pressure such as fear of failure, as well as poor study habits and laziness, were also found to be impacting on learners themselves, leading to their involvement in academic forms of corruption. The majority of surveyed respondents, 41.8%, expressed good knowledge of public anti-corruption institutions. Most online survey respondents, 51.9%, also indicated that institutions of the higher tertiary education sector are equipped or ready to deal with education corruption. There were, however, mixed findings on the perceived levels of knowledge within the higher and tertiary education institutions regarding the national anti-corruption strategy. This indicates that low or uneven levels of awareness of the NACS may contribute to the prevalence of corruption in the sector. As regards impact, it is clear from the quantitative responses in the online survey that some segments of society are impacted by educational corruption based on their demographic characteristics or level of vulnerability. For example, Zimbabwe is a youthful country with approximately 67% of the population being under the age of 35. Young people make up the most sizable chunk of their communities, making them more exposed to some forms of corruption. Young people also constitute the majority of students in higher education institutions, making them more likely to be impacted by various forms of education corruption. Sustained exposure to a culture of corruption means youth end up becoming products of corruption with no sense of value and integrity. They simply get captured in the process of corruption that is deemed proper in order to get things done or have things go your way. Ethics such as hard work, integrity, commitment, and other important values are thereby eroded within young people as they reach maturity and enter the workforce. As a result, the youths are more likely to believe in the approach of taking shortcuts to survive or get opportunities. As regards gendered forms of corruption, specific types of corruption, such as sextortion, impact females the most. Youth have limited financial resources and are highly likely to pay in kind as an alternative. Blackmail, other economic forms of extortion, linked to bribe-taking by individuals in positions of authority, and embezzlement robs people with disabilities of the amenities to enjoy education at par with the able-bodied. At a broader level, there are serious implications when the products coming out of higher and tertiary education institutions are perceived to be half-baked, when corruption diverts resources which could otherwise be used for providing world-class education. The knock-on effects are then felt in lower levels of productivity and quality of work in the various sectors in which these youths are employed. Corruption also impacts public confidence in the sector if left unchecked. The study makes several recommendations in line with the findings, and these are just a few of them, demonstrating the range of practical actions which stakeholders can champion to curb corruption in the higher and tertiary education sector. For example, Parliament is urged to pass the Protected Disclosure Whistleblower Protection Bill and Witness Protection Bill to protect people reporting for campaigning against corruption within higher education institutions. In addition, there is a need to pass standalone national legislation that criminalizes sextortion to curb the practice within higher education institutions. Linked to this, the Zimbabwe Gender Commission is encouraged to recognize sextortion as a specific form of abuse lying at the intersection of anti-corruption and gender-based violence. The Commission should regularly investigate, report, and recommend any acts of sextortion for prosecution in line with the provisions of the Constitution of Zimbabwe. The Ministry of Higher and Tertiary Education, Science and Technology Development is encouraged to explore innovative ways of financing the construction of adequate student accommodation and related amenities at state-owned institutions to reduce bribe-taking behavior by administrative staff. The ministry should also promote the adoption of enterprise resource planning systems or integrated software systems and online platforms in the day-to-day running of higher education institutions to reduce human interference in various processes such as enrollment and staff recruitment, which are reported to have an elevated risk of corruption. Acknowledging the significant progress made towards the adoption of electronic government procurement, EGP, or e-procurement, the government must expedite the finalization of all stages for full electronic government procurement to reduce the levels of human interference in the procurement process in state-owned higher education institutions and related departments. It is recommended that the Ministry of Finance and Economic Development and Investment Promotion sufficiently finance the construction of adequate and inclusive student accommodation and related amenities at state-owned learning institutions to reduce bribe behavior by administrative staff over scarce lodging. The Parliament of Zimbabwe is encouraged to scrutinize the higher and tertiary education sector to track the occurrence of the diverse forms of corruption. This includes working closely with the Office of the Auditor General to scrutinize expenditures towards this sector to ensure that resources are not diverted away from the provision of equitable and quality education due to acts of corruption. They are also encouraged to support adequate budgets towards student amenities in state-owned higher education institutions to curb bribe-taking behavior caused by inadequate infrastructure. The Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission is encouraged to conduct regular spot checks in the sector through secure platforms and support the implementation of anti-corruption programs through the Integrity Committee established in various institutions. Higher education institutions are encouraged to promote a culture of open dialogue with all internal stakeholders in the day-to-day running of institutions to curb corrupt acts and develop inclusive anti-corruption policies that factor in the needs of vulnerable groups impacted by various forms of corruption. In line with the objective of Article 13 of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, all higher education institutions should mainstream ethics and anti-corruption in the curriculum. Overall, corruption in the higher and tertiary education sector in Zimbabwe mirrors problems that are currently prevailing in the wider society that has been experiencing severe waves of corruption fueled by unfavorable economic and social conditions. As the 2024 Anti-Corruption Day is themed on the youth, this report provides an opportunity to reflect on the role of young people in curbing corruption for sustainable development. All concerned stakeholders are encouraged to collaborate under the National Anti-Corruption Strategy and related policy frameworks on an ongoing basis to grow networks of integrity within the higher and tertiary education sector. Show your support for this by promoting the banner #EducationIntegrityZimbabwe.